which is called Clinical Trials in Ukraine, discover hidden opportunities with the benefits that outweigh the risks. Let's wait for another minute for people to join, and then we will start our interesting and exciting program for today. Okay, so I think we can proceed to the webinar. And before we dive into all of the presentations, just a few housekeeping rules. So just to mention that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with the participants later in the month, and you will be able to listen to it again in case you would like to go back and hear to what was said during this webinar. The presentations we'll hear today will be about 10-15 minutes long, and you'll be able to ask questions after each presentation if time permits. And then after all the presentations, we will have a Q&A session, and feel free, and you're all encouraged to ask any questions you have about the current conditions and the situation with clinical trials industry in Ukraine. Without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, and the first speaker is Dr. Taisa Gerasymchuk, Director of the Preclinical and Clinical Trial Materials Evaluation Department of the State Expert Center of the Ministry of Health of Ukraine. And the topic of our presentation is State of Clinical Trials in Ukraine in 2024, Regulatory Authority Perspective. So Dr. Gerasymchuk, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Greetings to all participants of the meeting. My presentation is focused on status of clinical trials in Ukraine and the actions of the regulatory body in the general role of the State Expert Center in the file cycle of clinical trials in the current situation. Perhaps someone assumes that clinical trials in Ukraine several slowed down due to the full-scale military invasion of the Russian Federation military forces into Ukraine and made a significant impact on industry. However, this has been going on for the third year in a row, and we are continue to work and have prospective trends. Yes, it is not easy for all participants of clinical trials, but the potential of clinical trials in Ukraine has been preserved thanks to the enjoined efforts to all involved parties and stakeholders. Clinical trials, which has been started in the past years, currently ongoing. The Ministry of Health of Ukraine also grants permission of sponsors to conduct new clinical trials. The slide 1 presents information on the number of clinical trials that were approved and conducted at various stages at the beginning of the war, at the beginning of the 2023, at the beginning of 2024. At the time of 1st January of 2024, 309 clinical trials are being conducted in Ukraine. 41 of these has been started in 2023. 91 clinical trials approvals has been granted in Ukraine. The slide 2 shows information regarding receipts of application for new clinical trials and the number of positive recommendations which grants conducting of clinical trials. So in 8 months of 2024, 50 applications for clinical trials were received, and 37 clinical trials were approved by the regulator. The life cycle of clinical trials conducted in Ukraine is supported by significant changes to clinical trials protocols, as shown in slide 2 for 8 months, 2022, 2023, and 2024 years. In the current year, 28 clinical trials protocols were approved for changes to increase the number of research subjects. patients. As a number of substantial amendments indicated continuous oversight over the clinical studies during the life cycle of CTs and the compliance of clinical studies with the guidance of ICH GCP E6. Yes, as of April 1, 2024, 290 clinical trials are being conducted. Slide 3 showcase clinical trials filtered by clinical trials phases 1, 2, 3, 4. Phase 1, 20 clinical trials, 10 of which has a therapeutic profile of oncology. Phase 2, 57 clinical trials, 14 of which clinical trials has therapeutic profile of oncology, 10 clinical trials of neurology. Phase 3, 206 clinical trials, 96 clinical trials has the therapeutic profile of oncology, 25 clinical trials are neurology. Phase 4, 7 clinical trials. Slide 4 showcases the distribution by therapeutic profile of all clinical trials that are currently being conducted. Clinical trials is mostly performed in oncology, 114, neurology, 13 clinical trials, gastroenterology and proctology, 23, hematology, 18, rheumatology, 14, and other therapeutic profiles. Most of sponsors of clinical trials which are currently being conducted in Ukraine are located and or has origin from a list of the countries provided on slide 5. United States of America, 120 clinical trials, Switzerland, 14 clinical trials, Belgium, 26 clinical trials, Germany, 21 clinical trials, Sweden, 12 clinical trials. Other countries, 71 clinical trials. In addition, by the September 1, 2024, regulatory agency granted permission to conduct 88 clinical trials in Ukraine and awaits notification for first subject enrolled in clinical trials. You might ask, is there a positive trend towards the resumption of clinical trials industry in Ukraine today? Yes, at this point, the situation is changing positively, and we have a positive trend during the indicated period as shown in slide 6, namely, resumption of 45 clinical trials, which includes resumption of patient recruitment in those clinical trials whose activity was temporarily suspended. Receiving notifications about the start of 88 clinical trials. At the moment, the reverse process is taking place. The return of 46 patients to the initial site in Ukraine. Then in 2022-2023, 81 new clinical trial sites have been approved for ongoing and new studies. During January-September 2024, 164 sites were approved with substantial amendments for clinical trials and for new clinical trials. According to the list of local ethics commissions, there are about 1,000 plus active sites. See for slide 7. The next slide 8 shows that the clinical trials environment in Ukraine is positively changing and adapting for the challenges caused by war as such. Logistics of the delivery of investigated drugs and materials have been restored. Lab sampling and transfer of samples to central laboratories are carried out by the involvement of local laboratories and vendors if needed by the clinical trials protocols. Introduction of decentralized elements in clinical research, remote eligibility, hospitals infrastructure upgrades, power backup, shelters on site, electronic archives, electronic medical records for subject data, and subject history and the investigation product implemented by MOH, Ukraine, e-pro, e-consent. Remote monitoring of clinical trials output data, e-common registration form, risk-based monitoring of source of data review, source data verification for vital information. As shown in slide 9, the environment for investment and conducted research in clinical trials in Ukraine is improving due to flexibility of the regulatory agency in the decision-making process, reduction of the term of consideration of clinical trials materials to 30 days, significant changes to 25 days, digitalization of processes, communication with all stakeholders 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, assistance to sponsors at any point. Proactively moving towards EMA harmonization in regulatory processes and frameworks. Slide 10 provides a non-exhaustive list of European Union regulatory documents with which the state expert center works. All the above aspects contribute to the recovery of clinical research industry in Ukraine. The center's priorities for cooperating with interested parties remain unchanged and are supported by all available means of communications. Therefore, the regulatory body is determined to actively cooperate with sponsors regarding the consideration of new clinical trials protocols. Thank you for your attention. So at the moment, information about the control of clinical trials will be reported by the head of the audit office, Semenchenko Olena. Please, Olena.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Greetings to all participants of the meeting. So, let me say a few words about the governing of the clinical trials in Ukraine. As the State Expert Center is an authorized institution that conducts inspections of clinical trials. In Ukraine, it is called a clinical audit, but it is actually an inspection. The State Expert Center have conducted inspections serious side. Clinical trials industry on regular basis. Auditors, inspectors have taken part of European Union GCP Inspectors Working Group workshops. They have been invited to take part in EMA, FDA, PMDA inspections as third-party observers. The clinical trials audits and inspections has been present for many years and performed in regards FDA, EMA standards. The clinical trials audit and inspection has been carried out by State Expert Center annually, about 40-50 audit inspection per year, with the exception 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's evident the data presented on this slide. Despite all the challenges, we conduct 29 audit inspections. These were on-site inspections of clinical trial sites and their facilities. Next slide. Thank you. Mostly during inspections conducted this year, there were several audit findings. There were no critical findings, major findings not enduring, three inspections. Minor findings were detected during 26 inspection. To the city site and CRO has been given an appropriate period to provide closure of findings and cap a plan. Thus, we can state that despite the full-scale military aggression, clinical trials in Ukraine continue, are controlled and are conducted in compliance with the modern legal framework, which meets the international standards of good clinical practice. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you very much, Dr. Gerasymchuk and Dr. Semenchenko, for your thorough and very informative presentation about the current status of clinical trials in Ukraine from the regulator's perspective. And today's webinar is really represented fantastically by different stakeholders in the industry. So we have the representatives of the national regulator, we have the sites representatives, sponsors, and global CROs. So I think that everyone who connected to the meeting will benefit from it a lot. And again, I'm reminding you that this webinar is being recorded and you will have access to it later, and it will be shared with you later in the month. Just to remind you that you can leave your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A sections, and we'll read the questions to the speakers later, and they will be able to answer all your questions. And now we move to the second presentation, and it will be done by Dr. Ivano-Vyshnyvetskyy, President of the Ukrainian Association for Clinical Research and Managing Director, Ukraine at FutureMeds. And the presentation will be about clinical trials in Ukraine in 2024, sites perspective. So Dr. Vyshnyvetskyy, feel free to share your presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining this particularly important for Ukrainian clinical research sector event. We hope that it will have impact because Ukraine always was and still is important for clinical research industry and clinical research in general. So I can share some perspective since I'm representative of sites part of the industry. I want to share some experience and some understanding of what is going on in Ukraine from the site's perspective regarding clinical research. And just to start, I want to share the results of the survey of our partner association, European Business Association. They conducted a survey among clinical research sites about their operational readiness, about challenges, etc., etc. So this is main findings from this survey. They surveyed more than 120 sites, including, and you can see that quarter of the participants of respondents were sites from so-called vulnerable regions, south and east part of Ukraine. Nevertheless, vast majority of the sites claim that they are fully operational. And I expect I do not have full data set, but I expect that if we can focus on Kyiv and to the western part of Kyiv in Ukraine, which are more or less preferable for the sponsors for now, as we observe. So this number could even approach 100%, I would say. But we can say that majority of the sites claim that they are fully operational. They have absolutely adequate IMP supply. They have also adequate logistics to send the biosamples. The sites claim that they have no restrictions for on-site monitoring, and they claim a little bit more than this, but I understand that sites are a little bit biased. They are interested in clinical research. Maybe data from CROs and sponsors will be a little bit different how sites are ready. But nevertheless, as you can see, majority of the sites are very optimistic. They are very motivated to continue operations, to continue studies. And more than half of the sites have already active clinical trials in startup and active clinical trials. Majority of them also have in the process of feasibility assessment for future studies. So this is highlighting, showcasing, I don't know, that clinical research sector is alive in Ukraine. that it is regaining. It has rebounded from that toughest period in 2022. So this is general picture, but I have also my own experience to share. So as a manager of 3 clinical research sites and PI at one of the sites where I have, as a PI, active 9 studies and 5 enrolling studies. So in general, these 3 sites that I oversee as a country head of FutureMeds here in Ukraine, we currently have quite a lot of them. As for now, as for country with these challenges, so we have 37 active trials. 15 of them are recruiting. We have in pipeline 28 more awarded or on different stages of this process of to start studies quite soon. In 2024, we already screened and randomized these numbers of participants, and happy to share that our PIs, our teams are global top enrollers and at some indications. So we have quite a lot of activities here in Ukraine. At least this is our experience, our company's experience. So what can I say based on this experience right now in Ukraine? And first thing I would like to reflect and share with you. To start, I would like to maybe to present to you, not present, maybe but clinical research professionals, many clinical research professionals know many instruments to assess clinical trial complexity. And this is one of these. This is just visual, so I just picked this for visual form. So never mind that you cannot read anything. You understand that the more to the bottom, the more complex studies are in Ukraine. So my first observation from clinical research studies would come to Ukraine right now, that this pyramid is insufficient. So studies coming to Ukraine right now are much more complex. They are very difficult to recruit. They're loaded or even sometimes overloaded with procedures. So I understand that sponsors are coming to Ukraine with difficult studies. And this is the reality for us. But good thing and good sign probably for us also that we manage all this complexity. And I can say that Ukrainian sites can manage any study right now. So this is a good thing, and this is something that I'm happy to share with all of you. What are their observations and maybe some challenges we have that is good to discuss today? So regarding, let's start with staffing. So again, it is good thing that despite migration, despite some other challenges that started with combat operations in Ukraine, with full-scale invasion, I would say that number of trials that are coming to Ukraine and staff, qualified staff, they are balanced. So as always, we need more professionals, more experienced professionals. But for now, I don't think that this is kind of real huge challenge for us. So from science perspective, I can share here also that at some moment we waited and did not involve more site staff, just waited to understand if the industry regaining or not. and this was a challenge. So we were kind of not proactive but reactive, right? But for now, it is we understand that industry is rebounding, regaining. We have a good trend, so we are regaining in stuff also, and probably the same I expect from CROs with monitors and sponsors, etc. So about logistics, from sites perspective, this is business as usual. So we are sending biosamples, we are working with couriers, we are working with all those vendors. Nothing really changed for us as a site, mostly. Maybe a little bit more narrow window when we can send biosamples of only 3 days per week, because it is mostly by land, but from Ukraine to other countries. But again, nothing really different from what we had before the war. Electricity, common concern from sponsors, from CROs. I want to state here clearly that all the healthcare institutions in Ukraine are powered as a critical infrastructure. So first of all the electricity comes to healthcare institutions, and inside all the hospitals are provided with different generators and other backup systems. So no really issues from this perspective. Another point to consider is martial law and mobilization of males predominantly. But good news that our Ministry of Health provided updated legislation, and employees of the companies that work at clinical research industries, they also are considered as important for economy companies, and they can have this reservation from mobilization. So this is possible in Ukraine, and working in clinical research gives this opportunity for us. And for investigators, and probably to discuss with sponsors also, it is important that some caution should be in place with male potential participants. So it is important to understand, is there high risk of mobilizing this participant, discuss this with PI, with staff, and maybe abstain from recruiting patients who can be easily mobilized at any moment. So this is a particular situation in Ukraine. And regarding safety, again, nothing happened with staff at sites, with monitors, no incidents for all this. At least I don't know that something could happen or did happen, any injury during the work or related to work. So in fact, we understand the risk, but evidence says there was no something related to safety, something negative. Again, probably sponsors, and not only sponsors, know this very well, that when deciding to come or not to come to the country, sponsors first of all look at recruitment and quality, of course, but fast recruitment will beat other negative sides of particular country or particular situation. But by the way, this is well reflected in research, not only our thoughts, our hypotheses, and this is one of the studies that kind of proved this, or not evidenced this. But interesting for me, maybe not only for me, and I hope this will be part of our discussion today also. Does it also apply to not only to costs? So better and faster recruitment is beating this idea of cutting costs. But does it also apply to risks and not only costs? So faster recruitment, better recruitment with adequate quality, will it also for the sponsors outweigh potential risks? The answer is open. I don't know clearly, but we also had quite a lot of evidence that probably it beats. And big pharma companies, big sponsors, AstraZeneca, MSD, Celltrion, and other bigger, mid-sized, smaller sponsors are coming to Ukraine, are considering Ukraine for new trials, are expanding their presence right now with studies. So for me, this is probably the answer. Maybe yes, maybe not, but at least I hope that you remember the name of the webinar. All the benefits and speed of recruitment and access to patient population and quality that Ukrainian side demonstrate. This is all in general outweigh the risks. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much. I will be happy to answer questions right now or in the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vyshnyvetskyy. As always, very insightful and very professional. I think you're the person who is aware of the current situation in the whole country in the industry. So really happy that you are able to talk to the people who joined today. There is a question. We'll take one question from the chat for you. And what is the feedback from patients participating in clinical trials in Ukraine?
Patients are different, but in general, majority of patients that I particularly communicated, they are happy about having this opportunity to participate because this is an option that they almost lost when the war started, full-scale invasion, I mean, and many patients knew about this opportunity and they were struggling when they didn't get access to clinical research as an treatment option, as a care option. They get a lot. Feedback is good. So we are happy with our patients that we are providing them access to studies.
Okay, thank you. I'll actually ask a follow-up question later in the Q&A session about that. We have a few other questions in the chat, but we'll leave them for the Q&A session, for the panel discussion. And I think now we can move to our next speaker. And Dr. John Steinfeld is the Vice President of Clinical Development for Areteia Therapeutics, and he will talk to us about the sponsor's perspective of conducting clinical trials in Ukraine in 2024. And personally from myself, I would like to say a huge thank you to the company and to John for being brave and working in Ukraine, because as you know, not many companies are as brave as you are. So thank you very much, and our patients do appreciate this a lot. So thanks.
Thank you. I've actually run studies in Ukraine in the past. One of my favorite memories was of a clinical supply chain question about a truck about 10 years ago that ran off the road, and the driver decided better to get to safety rather than stay with the truck in the middle of winter in Ukraine. So, so that was fun to manage. All right. So let's go to the next slide quickly. So just I want to let you know about our company. We are, you probably have not heard of us, and that's because we're not a commercial company. We are a company that is in R&D. So we are we were formed specifically to develop a new drug, which has the potential to be the first oral drug for eosinophilic asthma. We're committed to this as a global plan, and that of course includes countries and regions such as the Ukraine. Let's go to the next slide. So the next slide shows our clinical trials. And so we have 3 ongoing clinical trials. And these are large clinical trials with a total of around 2,875 patients. The reason why I'm showing this slide is because the Ukraine is participating in all three of these studies. The two exacerbation studies are similar, and because we don't want to we don't want to have an overrepresentation of Ukraine in one of the studies, we've shifted recruitment from one to the other. But this means that we've been very happy with recruitment in Ukraine, very quick recruitment. And the bottom study, the XL4 study, is a spirometry study, and that's an important study to have sites that have the expertise with spirometry, and we've been very happy also with Ukraine's spirometry technique. One thing as an overall note is that Ivan has been our national principal investigator and has been an excellent resource to help us with identifying what specific issues each site is having, making sure we have the right sites, and the unique characteristics of running clinical trials in Ukraine. So it's been excellent to have Ivan helping us. Let's go to the next slide. So there are opportunities from the sponsor's perspective. We're looking for, usually in clinical trials, in the respiratory space, we're looking for advanced medical care. We often need tertiary care centers. The population that we're looking for is a small percentage of the overall asthma population, and they're typically seen by specialists. We also want that established medical infrastructure to make sure that patients have had a complete workup, looking for other diseases that could be causing their symptoms, and just making sure that they have access to care. There's also, there are plenty of experienced sites in Ukraine. Ukraine has been used multiple times in large phase 3 studies, and they have experience with the study equipment. Spirometry in clinical trials, if it's central spirometry, is typically performed by Clario. Clario used to be known as ERT. They also perform ECG equipment and overreads. So the Ukraine sites have experience with this equipment. It's very important because it's very different to perform spirometry in a clinical trial than performing spirometry for clinical use. There are different guidelines, there are different quality grades, and so it's very important to make sure that sites have this experience, and that's where Ukraine has been a great resource. Laboratory testing, it's in some studies you can perform local laboratory testing, but in many of the studies that I run, we're looking at eosinophil levels, and therefore they have to be standardized and performed at a central region, a central laboratory. And I'll get into that next because that actually leads to a challenge. As far as location, can we go back? Sorry. So as far as location, Ukraine is close to other countries that are participating in global clinical trials. That's good because we can discuss Ukraine in relationship with a region, with the Eastern European region. And also it means that there's a shorter distance to central labs than other regions. So let's go to the next slide. So we also have a patient population that's comfortable with technology. In our clinical trials, we rely on electronic diaries, and these electronic diaries are sometimes part of a cell phone, and sometimes they're a standalone device, but certainly the population is used to these devices. They're also interested in participating in clinical trials. For some of the studies, especially the studies that we are running, these are for a new type of advanced care that isn't necessarily available for all patients. And also response to therapy can be extrapolated from Western European data. Often if a drug will work in a Western population, Western European population, then it will have a similar effect in the Eastern European population. That includes safety as well. The medical care, there's similar standards of care. The treatment of asthma is similar in Ukraine as in other regions. There are some limitations in access to advanced care. And when I talk about advanced care, I'm talking about the biologic therapies for asthma. And so that actually leads to an opportunity for us because while it's difficult to perform a study comparing patients that are already on advanced care, we are developing a drug that is in the same indication as advanced care. So if that advanced care, the advanced biologic is not available in Ukraine, that actually makes it a more attractive region because we can perform, we can recruit patients that aren't already on that advanced care and study them and be able to extrapolate those results. So this is helpful for us. Let's go to the next slide. So there are challenges, and there are challenges for every country. There are obvious limitations due to the ongoing conflict. We've focused most of our sites in Western Ukraine. Power for storage of supplies is unpredictable. Then if there are some sites that require full refrigeration or freezing, that can be difficult. Our drug is stable at room temperature, so it's less of an issue for us. Site visits may not be possible at times and have to be flexible. And longer studies will require confidence that the sites and participants will be able to complete the studies. So we run 52-week studies. We feel that that's an acceptable risk to take on. There's also a concern that limited resources may have to be shifted away from research. And that's, again, that's just something we accept. Importation of study supplies can take longer than other countries. This actually has been independent of the conflict. There have been times in the past where custom clearance through Ukraine can take longer and is unpredictable. And transportation within Ukraine may be disrupted. As I mentioned earlier, we did have that about 10 years ago. Transportation in the winter by road can be unpredictable in any country that has harsh winters. We have run into a time-sensitive issue for testing. We're studying eosinophils and neutrophils, and both of those assessments can be, the samples can be delayed or degraded if there's more than 2 or 3 days of shipping. Then even though the shipping is to a close-by central laboratory, it can still lead to degraded samples and results that are not evaluable or not reliable. We did implement a fix for this, and the Ukraine sites have been really fantastic, where they're performing manual blood smears at the site and including those in lab shipments. So that means that even if the sample is degraded, the smears on slides are able to be used for a full evaluation. So that's been very, very helpful. The sites have been great. Let's go to the next slide. So it's been a positive experience so far. It's been lower than average country screen fail rate. There's been careful review of inclusion and exclusion in medical records. Recruitment has been above the country screening targets. We exceeded our site selection number, which means that more quality sites are willing to participate. We have very engaged principal investigators and site staff. There's one thing that was actually brought up in the ERS during one of the results presentations that and we have seen the same, is that countries such as Ukraine often have lower asthma exacerbation rates than other countries. So that's an area that we have to watch very carefully in our exacerbation studies. But if you're evaluating spirometry or lab testing, lab changes, or safety, then those concerns are not as you're not as concerned about exacerbations. Then those results are really excellent through the Ukraine and can be extrapolated very nicely. So as I mentioned, there's that one detail is that if you're looking at asthma exacerbations, it may be a little bit more difficult in Ukraine, but other assessments certainly can be performed with assurance that you'll have accurate results. So that's it for me. I'll be around for questions, or if there are any questions now.
Thank you, John. Thank you for sharing your experience. I have a question for myself, if you allow me, please. We have a few questions in the chat, but I think, yeah, there is actually one. Okay, I'll give you the
I see that.
question.
Want me to do the last one?
How did your company reach the decision to include Ukraine? Was Ukraine a second backup choice? What would your tips for other sponsors, CROs, to consider Ukraine?
Sure. So Ukraine was our first choice for our XL2 study, which is our large exacerbation study. And so they were not a backup country. Ukraine was right from the start. Ukraine was brought in to help rescue XL3 study, our other exacerbation study. So that's been helpful. And then for the lung function study, in that study, overall, we started with only a small number of countries in that study. And then when we expanded, we included Ukraine in that expansion as well. So as far as tips, I think that we often stagger our countries based on startup times. And I think I think that tips for Ukraine are, it's okay to expect a little bit more time. But now that we've seen that the EU, the EMA central submission process is incredibly lengthy, you could confidently state that getting studies started in Ukraine is actually faster than European sites that use the EMA. So that would be my biggest tip, is that Ukraine in the past might have been relatively slower to start up compared to the EU, but now it's the other way around.
And I think a huge contribution to this is actually the role of the national regulator in this, because the State Expert Center is reviewing the submissions quicker than regulators in other countries of the world, including European Union and the US. So I think, and that's a huge compliment to our Ukrainian regulator.
Yes, completely agree.
Okay, good. So we'll continue with the questions in the Q&A session, the panel discussion, and I think now we can move to the next presenter, and we'll listen to Dr. Vitaliy Solskyy, Delivery Director, Biopharma Global Project Delivery at Fortrea, and he will share the experience of a global CRO's perspective in conducting clinical trials in Ukraine in 2024. So Vitaliy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roman. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Vitaliy Solskyy. I'm a doctor, gynecologist by background, actually. And I'm from Kyiv, Ukraine, and still working in Kyiv, Ukraine, however, in very global position. So basically, I'm really happy to be here and to present in front of you. And, you did hear already different perspectives. You did hear perspective of our regulatory authority, of the site and then sponsor. And now I will try to give a perspective of a global CRO, and just to tell you who we are. And probably not everyone is familiar with the name Fortrea. So we known previously being a LabCorp drug development and previously Covance. So now we are Fortrea since mid of 2023. We're independent CRO. We spinned off a LabCorp company, and we are pretty big CRO, I would say. So around 18,000 people worldwide. You can see on this slide the spread where we have our staff. In the dark green, you can see where we have our offices. And in the light green, you can see countries which we are covering through our subcontractor CROs. We also have several phase 1 facilities, which you can see is blue pins on the screen. So, and I can proudly say that we did conduct around 6,000 trials overall, involving more than 92,000 investigators and more than 1 million patients. So if we go to the next slide, it's just to give you a footprint and to understand if you're not familiar with the Fortrea name. So yeah, here actually, I probably will not be repeating what was said. However, I just will reconfirm that from our perspective, we see exactly the same thing as regulatory authority was saying, as sites were saying, and as John from sponsor side was saying. So basically, we have our regulatory authorities and ethics committee fully operational. Basically, submissions now can be done remotely, which I mean is a step forward comparing to what it was years ago. So review timelines, as mentioned by representatives of regulatory authority, are really reduced. And I agree completely with John with the fact that they're now shorter actually than joint European timelines, where we have to use EU CTR on many occasions. It's now much faster to receive approval in Ukraine. In terms of how we operate, actually, because every company has its own approach, so we clearly operate in western and central part of Ukraine. So as I think Ivan was mentioning, from Kyiv and to the west of Kyiv, we operate easily in all the sites. So for sites where we have medium to high risk, it's kind of Kharkiv, Sumy, Zaporizhia, Odessa, which are more to the east of the country or southeast, I would say. We exercise caution. We continue running ongoing studies there, and we always assess whether we run any new studies and discuss it with the sponsor, obviously, as well. And we obviously do not run any studies in Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Mariupol, which are occupied. So it's clear. So in terms of resources, we have fully available and operational staff. I mean, on our side, on the CRO side, we have startup operations, commercial agreements, clinical operations, project management, data management, stats, everything. Actually, we have a lot of departments located in Ukraine, and they're fully operational. So we have full capacity of running business as usual. So if you can go to the next slide, to talk a bit more about what we see on the site side. And again, I can only reconfirm everything with what was said. And actually, I wanted to make sure to highlight a few things. So as you did see from the presentation from regulatory authority, we obviously have less studies than we did have previously before invasion started. So however, the number of studies is picking up, which is nice to see. Well, still the number is lower than it was, for example, before invasion. And this means that you not only have sites which are eager to participate in trials, and actually patients which are eager to participate as well. However, you face much lower competition. So if you look at from a sponsor perspective, then you have much lower competition, because sites which were running, for example, simultaneously 10, 12 studies in different indications now can be running 2, 3, 4 studies. So obviously, it's not only competition for the certain indication, but it's also much less of a competition for resources, which is very important. So also sites are now, and I think COVID played a bit of a role in this as well, because it was a worldwide issue, which every country did have to fix. So, and it gave a really big push for all the remote and DCT activities. So now our regulatory authority is allowing patient visit to be done via remotely, via telemedicine, and IMP direct to patients is also allowed. And basically, it's like I said, it started with the COVID. It's even improved now, so it's all fully operational. And now we also have a possibility to perform remote SDV, which was not possible before COVID at all in Ukraine, but now it's possible. So you see, there are some things which are positive, actually. We have to find positive things and negative things. So in terms of logistics, and this was indeed, I have to admit, this was indeed one of the main issues, especially at the beginning as the onset of the war. Up until fall 2022, quite honestly, for example, ambient shipments were not possible. So all ambient testing should have been done internally inside Ukraine. Frozen, they were able to be frozen for a longer time and then shipped, but ambient, they were really an issue. However, as of fall 2022, at least for our company, we clearly are full operation in this regard. We are sending samples, ambient samples to LabCorp Lab, which we are using most frequently because we were part of LabCorp, but still we have preferred relationship with them. So in Geneva, and they are coming into Geneva within 72 hours without really a lot of deviations from this. So frozen, as like I said, they were not an issue even earlier, but even less of an issue now. So it's not an issue at all. So we also have our key vendors locally, like for example, PharmaSoft is a one-stop shop for all types of IMP supplies and samples logistics. And I agree with John that sometimes it takes a bit more time to ship something into Ukraine. It was the case as well, even before the start of invasion as well. However, we, thanks to the fact that we have local depots, which we are usually using in majority of studies, and it was like this always, we are able to really mitigate these longer timelines, and at the end of the day, it's pretty convenient. So also we have vendors which are doing one-stop shop for patient transportation and reimbursement, and it's very convenient as well, and they're fully operational as well. So if we can go to the next slide. Then I would like to talk, because you did hear perspective of Array, perspective of the particular sponsor of the site. However, I can give you a perspective of a big company running studies in Ukraine. And like I said, obviously number didn't increase. It's obvious. I would lie if I would say this. However, I think we can be quite proud of what we have so far. So if we take this slide showing obviously Fortrea's experience. So we have during the war, I mean, since it started in February 2022, we did have more than 25 studies which were running in different stages of the study. 15 of those are still currently ongoing. We involved in the studies more than 100 sites. We during the time from February 2022 up until now, we newly randomized more than 1,000 patients. And if we count total number of patients which were participating, it's more than 2,000 patients which were ongoing on different stages of the studies since the beginning of invasion. So I think these figures are, quite self-explanatory, and it means that, industry is still alive. We would love it to be, to feel even better in Ukraine. However, we have what we have, and we are developing, and figures are increasing as representatives from Array were telling you on first slides. You can clearly see the pickup in the number of studies. So more and more sponsors are believing that it's possible to run studies in Ukraine. Not only possible, but it's really beneficial. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Here I wanted to, I have few slides with success story, but this one is really striking, and I can tell you I did participate. I was in charge as a delivery director of running studies for this sponsor at a certain period, yeah, I'm quite proud we managed what we managed. So two studies started. It's pulmonology company developing, John, like yours probably to some extent, developing purely drugs in pulmonology, quite for a number of years now. And so two studies started in 2021 before onset of the war, and everything was running smoothly. However, then in February 2022, obviously, the decision was made by the sponsor to halt both studies. I mean, halt enrollment in both studies. And it took some time for the sponsor, as you can see from the slide, up until December 2022, when the decision was made, and it was not an easy one, I have to tell you, how it was made, that Ukraine should be restarted and enrollment should be resumed. And as an outcome, enrollment was, and it was very successful. I will stop on this a bit later. So enrollment was actively ongoing for whole 2023. And as an outcome of very successful two studies ongoing, sponsor decided to open a third study, to activate third study in Ukraine, which was never running before the war, so it was a completely new one. And in 2024, two studies already completed enrollment. They're still ongoing, however, enrollment is already completed. And in summary, because three studies are quite successful, the sponsor is now planning to activate new sites and open fourth study in Ukraine at the end of this year, beginning of next. And some facts from this, from this story, is that actually for one of the studies, Ukraine simply saved the study. We randomized 558 patients, and Ukraine became the world #1 enroller, even despite was not enrolling from February to December 2022. And it allowed enrollment to be completed and study to be successful. So in another phase 3 study, which was in parallel running, Ukraine is in top 3 enrollers, and as you can see, also enrolled randomized 337 subjects, which is also a great achievement. In phase 1 study, which started after the onset of the war and finished already recruitment, Ukraine did, because it was phase 1 study, you cannot have too many sites in phase 1. However, sponsor was believing in Ukraine to that extent that they placed phase 1 study with Ukraine, and one site randomized 14 patients, which was more than planned. And again, like I said, phase 3 study is upcoming, and Ukraine will contribute with up to 10 sites for that study as well. So we can move to the next slide. And here I wanted to mention a few other striking examples. For example, in rare disease study, which was really very difficult to enroll, and we activated 8 sites. 6 of these 8 sites did enroll at least 1 patient, which is exceptional for this indication and for this rare disease. Recruitment was already completed, so this study started anew during the war, apologies. And SIVs were done only in December 2022, and as an outcome, 11 patients were randomized versus target of 5 patients for Ukraine. And again, Ukraine did make this study a success overall. So another example is, again, a gastroenterology study which started after the February 2022. We have 14 sites in Ukraine. All planned sites were activated, and 38 patients were randomized with very low screening failure rate. I remember John was mentioning this as well, and I can only confirm that usually screening failure rate in Ukraine in many indications is lower than overall. So far, because recruitment is still ongoing, 50% of all patients in the study recruited in Ukraine, actually, for that study. And last 2 examples, which you can see on this on your screen, is actually for studies which were ongoing at the time when of the onset of war, and sponsors at that those particular sponsors decided not to stop studies at all. So they were not, they were not recruiting, full disclosure. However, patients were still ongoing. Some of them were on treatment, some of them were in follow-up. And it was a tough decision for the sponsor. I fully admit this, and I can tell you for gynecological one, I was a delivery director overseeing that one, and it took me quite a discussion with the sponsor to convince them to continue with Ukraine without halting, without stopping patients. And so it was my personal commitment in this last one. However, as you can see, in first case, it was more than 200 patients ongoing as of February 2022. In another case, more than 60 ongoing. And in first case, we didn't have any patients which were lost to follow-up, even despite very active invasion ongoing. And in second one, only 3 patients were lost to follow-up out of more than 60. So basically, I think it can tell the story that Ukraine, even despite very challenging situation we are facing right now, is fully capable of running studies. And you can hear now perspectives of both, not both, but of sites, CRO, and sponsor, and we are all more or less telling the same. So I think for those potential sponsors who are still considering coming to Ukraine, I hope our presentations will help you to decide in favor of Ukraine, because Ukraine is really a super attractive market right now. And like I said, the competition is lower, and all sponsors are welcomed. So thank you much for your attention, and if any questions, I can address either now or at the Q&A session.
Thank you, Vitaliy, very much. And first of all, thank you for your impressive work and persuading your global management to continue work in Ukraine and getting new trials into Ukraine. So there is a question for you in the chat. So what is the procedure for performing remote SDV of paper medical source documentation?
Yeah, so there can be several options. One of the options, I think I didn't stop on this in too much details, but we have a site VivaVault. So basically, sites can enroll into site VivaVault, and in this case, then they can safely share all the medical records within the system, and CRAs can do completely remote SDV. And it's basically the preferred option. And many sites, if they are and this option is not only used in Ukraine, just to mention. So many sites around the globe can use this option, and sites which are in preference of using remote SDV over on-site monitoring. And these days we have more and more sites like this in US, for example. There are a lot of sites which are not even accepting CRAs any longer, some of them. So it's an option for a site not only in Ukraine but all over the world to perform an SDV. So yeah, and we use it in Ukraine as well.
Thank you. And actually, VivaVolt is one of the major players in the remote SDV arena. So a lot of countries use it and a lot of sites use it, and it's free for the sites. So
yeah, absolutely free. Yeah,
software for free, and it's very user friendly. So now we can thank you all the presenters for excellent presentations. I think everyone enjoyed them very much. And now we can move to the panel discussion: Is Ukraine a reasonable clinical trial destination? We have quite a few questions in the chat, and again, feel free to add more questions for our participants and presenters. And as of now, we have about 100 participants in the webinar, which is a very nice number. And I see that both the industries represented from the sponsors, from the CROs, from the sites. So we have a very nice representation today. And I would like to go back to the first question that was posted for Dr. Gerasymchuk. And so the question is, could you please clarify if the statistics that you showed in your presentation refers only to clinical trials of drugs only? And have clinical trials of vaccines and medical devices been conducted in our country for the given time, and in what percentage comparing to investigate medications, if any? Thank you. And I think there was also the mentioning of medical devices as well. So yeah, so vaccines, medical devices, or just clinical trials, the statistics that you showed in your presentation, Dr. Gerasymchuk.
Статистика чи відноситься до вакцин і девайсів. Девайси в нас же ж по законодавству не проводяться. А вакцини так. Медичні продукти і вакцини.
Yeah, the answer is State Expert Center does not provide expert evaluation of drug devices, but vaccines is part of your
Yeah, so to answer the question, I will sum up that the statistics applies only to to medications and including vaccines, but medical devices are regulated by another national agency. And exactly. But we did have quite a few medical device trials in Ukraine during full-scale invasion. So I hope that answers your question. So I think the next question is, I think anyone who feels like answering it, what are the broader public health priorities in Ukraine, and how might they affect the resources available for clinical trials? I think it's a very broad question, so I think everyone from each perspective can contribute to this. So feel free to whoever wants to start.
Sorry, Roman, could you please repeat the question? Because
yes, so the question is, what are the broader public health priorities in Ukraine right now, considering the war? I think the person is asking, and how might they affect the resources available for clinical trials?
Interesting question. Unfortunately, there is no Minister of Health representative here.
We can do the panel discussion right now in this regards, because here are so many challenges such as logistics, such as supplies, as well as you mentioned, because some regions like Sumy at this point or Kharkiv are really not in bad public health situation, but after recent airstrikes or Kramatorsk, people now do not have water, for example, and this obviously affects entire industry, us and everyone as well. So we can see the same situation in borderline cities, and in general we're okay. I mean, the logistics now is stable, supplies are coming. Yes, it's not that easy without air connections. However, the sponsor are managing to do it, and they're required by prime labs and elite certified labs within 72 hours.
Yeah, I can add also here, if you allow me. Minister of Health is focusing and National Health, how to say, in
National Standardized
National Health
Service.
Yeah, service. They are focused on providing all the services that they are pointed to provide. They support the industry, so they change regulations when the industry requests. And I cannot say that they are kind of against or something like in conflict of managing resources, and this does not support clinical research. So there is no any problem with regulatory authority, with Ministry of Health. Majority of clinical trial operations are self-sufficient, especially in western part of the country. So
yeah, I can probably, Ivan, I can probably add if you allow me. So
Yeah,
basically,
sure.
I would say oppositely, because I mean, yes, of course, there are other areas where our healthcare system need to focus. However, if we talk about clinical trials, and we are here talking about clinical trials, we can see that we have absolutely enough resources because because you know, when you have no resources, you can see, like in UK, for example, I would not be opening, you know, something new to many people here. In UK, they have such a backlog in approvals of studies that it became really unbelievable. In Ukraine, even despite war, situation is absolutely opposite. That we are seeing faster approvals of clinical trials, which means resources are there, of course. Because if they would not be there, then it will be an issue like UK is having it now. So, and in terms of resources at sites, as I already mentioned, I think it's quite opposite. Instead of expecting that you would have less resources, you have more resources at sites because they're less, they have a less workload because they have fewer studies and still running at each site. And at the same time, all the stuff is there. I mean, of course, some people did move here and there. However, overall, it's not affecting site stuff. So site staff is pretty stable. They have enough resources to run studies, even more studies than they are running right now. It's what we see. So I think that there is no issue in resources at all, quite opposite.
And also the Ministry of Health is prioritizing clinical trials industry because I think just a few months ago, they started a working group on clinical trials. And I think Dr. Vyshnyvetskyy is a member of this group. And this group is aimed at improving the regulatory conditions in Ukraine for clinical trials and to make Ukraine even more attractive to the sponsors and the CROs to bring more studies into the country. So the Ministry of Healthcare is definitely prioritizing this, and also the European Business Association Subcommittee on Clinical Trials is playing an active role in this. So I think everyone in the industry is working proactively to increase the number of sites and to communicate the message that Ukraine is operational and the sites are functional in Ukraine and can deliver good results. Yeah, there is a raised hand.
Yeah, this is for John. Hi, John. I know you mentioned that you started with Ukraine as the first choice from a sponsor standpoint, right? On your program, it's actually a twofold question. When it comes to sort of building contingency, were you considering adding more sites in other countries as backup to Ukraine? That's the first part of the question, and the second part of the question is, how did you go about convincing from a risk standpoint internally, right? Because I just speaking with sponsors, I mean, there's that hesitation to a degree to start the studies. So could you shed some light on those two areas? Because I think that will be very helpful.
Sure. So we actually didn't have to worry about risk for starting in Ukraine. The biggest risks that we often have where we would decide to not use a country would be if we could not monitor safety of subjects, if we could not be sure about continuity of care, or if there would be sanctions. So, for example, I was with a previous company before this, and that previous country was running a study, and Russia was included in the study. And when the invasion happened, we stopped Russia, could not use Russia anymore, and had to find a way to actually monitor the safety of the patients that had already been exposed to study drug. So that's more of a risk to if there's a country where you may have sanctions against them, because it's very difficult to run a study when sanctions are in place, because you can't pay sites, you can't ship things in or anything else. So we're not worried about sanctions for Ukraine and never were. We also knew that this type of study, that these studies were looking at asthma, which is a breathing disease that is mostly managed at home, and so patients are still going to have to breathe no matter what is happening. So it's an area that you can still perform research in Ukraine. We also bring in our own equipment, so we bring in spirometry devices, we bring in ECGs. So mainly, the only thing we need for a study is the ability to bring in equipment, to pay for sites and pay for care, and for there to be patients available. And Ukraine meets all of those criteria. That's why it was in our first wave. I think as far as for what other, your second part of your question was what other sponsors should be looking for in Ukraine. Yeah, and I think there what you need to make sure is similar to what we looked at. Is this a disease state where it's common enough in Ukraine that there are enough patients and that they have the characteristics that you're looking for. So I brought it up briefly in my slides. Some studies are looking at a comparison between biologic therapy and their own therapy. Well, if you need a large percentage of patients to be on biologic therapy, then that may not be ideal for Ukraine. But that's very few studies are actually like that. If you're looking for patients that have similar characteristics to Europe, but may not have access to some of those same levels of care, then Ukraine is ideal for that type of situation. And we expanded, so we expanded everywhere. We expanded the number of sites in Ukraine, but we also expanded the number of sites in the US. So we just overall expanded our footprint, and we certainly included Ukraine in that as far as expansion.
Great, thank you, John. I mean, that sounds like you guys took the patient-first approach.
Yes.
Truly, right? Starting with the patient and then sorting out the operations later, right? In the background, which is amazing to hear. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and like I said, there are logistics issues for every country, and Ukraine's logistics issue because of the invasion actually were not as big as we would see with other countries. One other thing I would note, companies don't usually get any good credit points for anything, but we have had multiple investigators outside of Ukraine thank us for including Ukraine in the study. So that was unexpected and nice to hear.
That's great. Wow. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much. So the next message in the chat is more of a comment, and we have different site networks in Ukraine as well functioning, and all of them are ready to pick up studies and continue with the studies. So John, Vitaliy, feel free to reach out to these sites. They all are ready to start and do the trials. They have backups for power supplies, and have the staff and ready to work. So feel free to reach out to these sites and talk to them about cooperation. So the next question is, I think, applies more to Ivan and Dr. Gerasymchuk. A question about informed consent forms and patient questionnaires, surveys, patient materials. Are they only in Ukrainian or proposed to patients in both Ukrainian and Russian to be chosen from? So please, if you can comment on that. And also, I mean, the CROs and the sponsors, do you submit documents only in Ukrainian or in different languages for a review?
Yeah, for me personally, I will start if you don't mind. For me personally, I didn't understand why in Ukraine we still, for years, with having state or governed by state kind of state language as Ukrainian, the only Ukrainian, and everyone in this country speaks and understands Ukrainian, even if this is not the major or mother tongue. But everyone understands clearly, absolutely Ukrainian. Why for many years we submitted to array two languages, Russian and Ukrainian? So as I understand now, this practice has stopped And right now, only Ukrainian language is proving, and that's it, and it works.
It's only in one language.
Yeah, so only one language.
Yeah, actually, I would say, you know, our experience, we were not submitting in Russian even before 2022. So it was possible to submit all documents. So we were only submitting potential and ICF. We wanted some people, you know, to read ICF in Russian, but it was before 2022, of course. So from a CRO perspective, we were not translating anything into Russian at all for years. So yeah. And I agree with you, Ivan, that it should be like this.
And from a sponsor standpoint, we submit ICFs in whatever language is needed for that specific site. So for example, in the US, the official language is English. Everybody is supposed to know English, but we have multiple sites that have asked for North American Spanish as well. So we submit whatever ICF language will help that site. And we do it on a site-by-site basis, not for the country.
There was also a comment from Andriy Masic, who's the head of Novotek CRO in Ukraine, also a global CRO, that they submit only Ukrainian patient documents only in Ukrainian. So thank you for your comment, Andriy, in the chat. Yep, I have a question. I think whoever can answer it and have information about that, because we know that during the full-scale invasion, a lot of patients transferred from Ukraine to other countries. And I'm wondering if there is experience from the site's perspective, or the CROs or the sponsors, if there's feedback from the patients who transferred abroad and then returned back to Ukraine, whether they noticed any difference in clinical trial execution or attitudes or something in this area. Do you have any information, or can you comment on that?
If you allow, I have experience. We were one of the first, if not the first, site in Ukraine who transferred first patient outside. This was first week after the war started, and the patient with cancer had to be randomized. So we were very fast, and the window was closing. We were very fast, and for the sponsor, it was kind of first experience, and we co-created this experience together with the sponsor. So I can say that several patients that were moved outside of Ukraine with first days or months of the war, all of them came back. All of them continue participate. Our patients, at least, continue participating at our sites, except one from occupied territory. So he still lives in other country and continue participating. But all the patients that came back said that they're much more happy to participate at Ukrainian sites, actually, because of many reasons, and not only cultural and language reasons. So different attitude, different approach, different many things. So this is what I can share about relocated patients. Maybe some other participants can share their own experience.
From a sponsor standpoint, it's possible to switch sites. I don't know if we have ever switched countries. We would obviously prefer that patients remain in the same area, but understand if they're not able to. Asthma is also relatively unique here, because asthma, whenever patients move, it actually tends to worsen their asthma because of stirring up all the dust and the acts of movement and moving to a different exposures and environment. So we try to encourage patients to stay, but we've moved within country at other times, but I don't think we've moved outside of the country.
Okay, thank you for the feedback. Another question, I think it comes back to John, what you mentioned, that your company is a not-for-profit company, right?
No, we're not a public company. So we are a company that's still in R&D. We don't sell any drug. So we're a non-commercial company.
So, and do you think, and that's a question to all of the presenters, do you think that the status in terms of profit plays any role in deciding whether to include Ukraine in the studies? Because we see that, because we work with the National Institute of Health, which is a US governmental agency, and they've expanded their trials and operations in Ukraine during full-scale invasion. You, as presenting an R&D company, you are working in Ukraine, but we see that not many for-profit companies are resuming their operations. Only a small number of them are resuming operations in Ukraine. So do you think this profit status influences the choice and the decision whether to resume work in Ukraine or not?
So that part of that answer is if you are a commercial stage company, typically you internally require that you can only perform research in countries where you are planning to commercialize. And so some companies, if there are drugs that are more expensive to ship, cold chain storage, or drugs that are going to end up being very expensive, and if they can't say that they're going to include Ukraine in their plans for commercialization after the drug is approved, then they often can't include Ukraine in that in the R&D. So that tells you something, that if company Y is choosing not to develop drug X in Ukraine, it's because they're also not planning on commercializing that drug in Ukraine. We're a different situation. An oral drug that's easy to ship and easy to store, there wouldn't be a reason we wouldn't commercialize in Ukraine once our drug is approved.
Yeah,
and NIH is the same, because NIH doesn't commercialize anything, so they can of course do any study in Ukraine. Sorry.
Yeah, and I can give a CRO perspective as well here, because we see, unfortunately I cannot name clients due to confidentiality reasons. However, I can tell you that from studies which are ongoing and which were starting in Ukraine, we did have clients of different sizes, and quite honestly, sometimes it can be quite opposite. That for a smaller company, it can be more of an issue to agree to come to Ukraine, even though smaller companies used to make decisions faster, as we all know, and purely, small biotech, so really, startups, they usually only few people and they can make decisions faster. However, they have issues because they don't want they want to de-risk the study, I would say. However, I think what we discussed here, at least for the sponsors who are present, can tell the story that actually they're not. I mean, there are risks, but risks are everywhere, honestly speaking. And risks in Ukraine, benefits are overweighting risks. However, with bigger companies, it also can be one option is what John mentioned. Another is what is a company decision. So at the onset of work, big pharma, they made a decision on what they will be doing with studies in Ukraine. And they revise this decision. Sometimes this revision process is lengthy. So if they decided at one point that they are not placing new studies in Ukraine, probably next point will come in half a year, and with big company, it's impossible to do it otherwise, Smaller companies are much more flexible with this. So they can decide today, we don't want to go to Ukraine. In 2 weeks, they go to Ukraine. So it's easier. So it's to do with this as well. So with company general policy on this topic as well.
Yeah, Vitaliy is 100% correct. I've worked in large companies and small companies. Adding a new company in a large, adding a new country in a large company can take months. So
yeah, exactly. So,
well, thank you very much.
I just last thing to mention here: the major contributors of trials in Ukraine in numbers right now are still biggest pharma companies right now. Open data. So AstraZeneca, MSD are major contributors right now. So this is your question also.
Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, we can talk about this forever, since everyone is so engaged in this topic and in this industry. But we have about a minute left in the webinar. So could you please take home message, 30-second message to the audience, and then we'll finish the webinar for today. Feel free to start, whoever wants to be the first one.
Yeah, well,
I
I
think
can
Ivan-
start. Okay,
and Ivan
sorry,
should
John,
have the
go ahead.
last. No, go ahead. But Ivan should be the last.
Okay, yeah, well, yeah, I will start, and I think what we were discussing here convinced people on the phone and on the call, and probably those with whom they will be talking, that Ukraine is still very open to clinical trials, actually running them very successfully, even more successful than it was running it before. And so we really would be pleased to see more and more studies coming into Ukraine, and I think sponsors will be equally happy as sponsors which we have at Fortrea, for example, because they are all happy. Those sponsors which are placing studies currently in Ukraine or decided not to stop them or restarted them, they're all very happy. And this is, I think, very important outcome for us.
And also the speed to startup countries is often one of the deciding factors that sponsors use when looking at where they're going to go. So the fact that Ukraine has a faster startup time than the EU, than the EMA countries, and then many other countries keep that speed going much faster than the UK. This is an opportunity for Ukraine rather than a challenge. Thanks.
Thank you. And just to not to reiterate everything what already was said today, I just want to say big thank you to our co-host and co-organizer, State Expert Center of Ministry of Health. They are very supportive during this period. They contributed a lot to what we have to this, I would say, success in our circumstances. So thank you very much, and we still hope for our collaboration.
Thank you very much, Ivan Ivanovich, and participants. We are welcoming everyone to join Ukrainian clinical trials within regulatory framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great
Bye.
webinar. Have a nice rest of the day. Yep. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Same to you.
All who joined. Thank you.